God damn. Always happens. Always happens. Welcome to another video. I'm ahead of the curve, and in this book review, I will be discussing Albert Camus' The Plague, which was written and published in 1947. Albert Camus is most famously called an existentialist, but in actual fact, he, throughout his entire life, said that, no, don't call me an existentialist, call me an absurdist. So what does absurdism mean? Well, if you're unaware, absurdism is basically viewing life as ultimately pointless, but still, why not just make the most of it, essentially. To live is to rebel. That is a sort of axiomatic perception that Camus himself brought into the existential philosophy sort of area. And so I think absurdism personally is probably the best outlook to have in terms of an existential outlook. It's because if you're a nihilist, then, you know, the Latin nihil, nothing, and then ist, nothing ist. As a nihilist, you're kind of trapped. And an existentialist, well, there's not much wrong with that, I suppose. But absurdism just, it kind of has a rebellious and interesting tone behind it. So yeah, Albert Camus was the person who coined absurdism. And so yeah, I wanted to correct that sort of denunciation. He's often called even a nihilist at some points by some people, but no, I call him what he wished to be called, an absurdist, because that is essentially what he was, the charismatic sort of writer, journalist, orator that he was. So this is actually the third book that I've read by Camus. The first being The Myth of Sisyphus, which I've reviewed. You can go and watch if you wish, but excuse my awkwardness because it is my first video that I ever did. So be prepared for that not to be as good as quality as this one might be, if at all. But yeah, The Myth of Sisyphus was the first one that I read by Camus, and then The Stranger, and now The Plague. The Myth of Sisyphus, well, I won't really give that away. I'll make you go and watch that yourself. But moving on to The Stranger, I haven't actually reviewed that yet, and you might be wondering why the hell not, you know? Why you're reviewing The Plague and not The Stranger? Why in that order, so to speak? And the reason is because the first time I read it, I felt like I didn't have enough to say to justify a video, because I don't really want to just put something out that lacks some sort of, well, you might call it a tangent, but some sort of opinion that I have or any points that I want to put across. So it didn't really provoke that in me to the extent of making a video. But I want to reread it, and because it is a very short book, I will reread it very soon. And so this is the time for me to say, like all cringy YouTubers do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to, well, to see more of this, but also to see The Stranger, me review The Stranger at some point. So instead of me summarising the book off the top of my head, because that usually doesn't work very well, I'll just read what's on the back. The townspeople of Oran are in the grip of a deadly plague, which spread from rats and now condemns its human victims to a swift and horrifying death. Forced into quarantine, ever so familiar, in this sweltering heat, each person responds in their own way to the lethal disease. Some resign themselves to fate, some seek blame and revenge, and a few, like the unheroic Dr. Rooks, join forces to defy the terror. Written just after the Nazi occupation of France, The Plague is a taut, visceral depiction of resistance against a seemingly uncontrollable evil. This also won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which in itself should tell you something, or at least should encourage you about the book itself. So as I've been alluding to throughout the video, hence the plague mask, as I've been alluding to, this book is highly similar in its tone to what we've actually been seeing in the past year, as of this time of being recorded, which is COVID-19, the pandemic of the modern age. So, as you would self-evidently infer from the title, The Plague, it does deal, and from the description, it does deal with a pandemic. And I felt for me, this is probably the best time to read the book. Well, that and probably when it was published, because it would have captured the hearts of many people who are well post-war. But that's quite detailed, and I don't really know enough about that to talk about it in confidence. But that's just something that was alluded to in the foreword, which is the book, when published, it was very relevant because of certain variables that came together. But anyway, back to my main point. This book is arguably most relevant right now because we actually can experience what is being said in this piece for ourselves. We don't only have to read the book to find out, you know, what being distant from your family members or friends actually feels like. Like we've actually had to do that. And so in this way, this book is highly, highly relevant to these times at the moment. And this is probably why it was just that much more enjoyable for me to read, personally. So I marked a page in the book to read to you because I do like a good passage reading. There have been as many plagues in the world as there have been wars, yet plagues and wars always find people equally unprepared. When war breaks out, people say it won't last, it's too stupid. And war is certainly too stupid, but that doesn't prevent it from lasting. So what the passage is saying is that something similar to actually something I behaved in accordance to. When COVID first kind of came about, when it first happened, I myself was quite sceptical. Not of its existence, obviously, but of its overall effect and what it would actually do to a country or, at this point, the globe. And this is because I never thought really that it would come so far as it did, like throughout the different countries. I didn't really think much of it at first because, you know, these sort of things happen, and I like to remain skeptical when these sort of big news icons come up and the media are just eating it all up. You know, I'm very skeptical of that. But then there came a point when you start to realise that actually COVID did spread quite fast and it did actually kill a lot of people. Although some people would probably debate that and say the flu killed more or less the same amount of people each year or even more. So that's for another sort of video. But my point is that I was ready to sort of deny the COVID ever happening or coming across to England, which is where I'm from. And so, if you haven't already noticed. And so I was in sort of denial that it would even happen. And up until, I don't know, well, I got this new face mask, as I showcased. I got the new face mask, and I got it so late. It's because I'd be using the surgical masks before, like the default ones, which you can probably see here. Because I was like, what's the point of getting a mask when the pandemic could just be over in like 2 months or a month? And I had that mentality for a long time. And not only was that a very broad mistake, but it was also an honest one, because I suppose it's with the hope of it ending. This sort of action of not buying a mask, a proper one, because you think it might end or you think it might all blow over. That's certainly what happened with me. I thought, well, I assumed that even when it first came about, as I mentioned, that it would just go away swiftly. And here we are nearly a year later, if not a year later. Yeah, more than a year later, when the first cases came about. And we're still here fighting the social impacts, implications of COVID. But interestingly, the contrary happened. Because I was quite laid back about it, like I just said, but other people were just going to stores or shops and they were buying as much toilet roll as they possibly could. They were buying loads of canned food, and they were just panicking. There was a moral panic about what to do, how to not die with this pandemic swooping over us. And I didn't really buy that sort of mentality, but I know a lot did. They panicked, and that's fair, I suppose. Although I would say the media definitely overplayed the impact of it, not to suppress the impact itself, but they definitely gave the impression that it was something much more worse than the flu, when whilst the symptoms are a lot worse and more sudden than the flu is, it still has the same amount of deaths that have come from it, or more or less. Yeah, so don't take what I'm saying as like completely factual. I'm just saying in general terms, the flu kills more, if not the same amount of people that COVID has this year. And that's what I'm saying, is that the media overplayed it, for sure. At least when it first came about, anyway. And to add a sub-point to that, I would also add, I would recite the Joker's quote from The Dark Knight, which is, if some of you might already know, but one of my favourite films. And it is, when the chips are down, these civilised people, they'll eat each other. And what happened during the pandemic? Well, that very thing just happened. Everyone was civil until they weren't. When the chips were down, they panicked, and they lived out Machiavelli's maxim, which is, the ends justify the means. And that was very much the case. But also, again, on the opposite of that perspective, I must add some kind of justification for that. Because on the other side of that, we can see post-World War II, a lot of people were very kind to one another. It seemed that there was a mutual understanding of malevolence. And so the opposite, which is benevolence, could only take place in response. And so many people were helping each other out in the face of, for example, London being completely in ruins, just being desecrated in general by the Blitzkrieg. And so there are two polar opposites to mankind in that regard. When a major catastrophe happens, when the chips are down, people are either mad dogs, or they view this malevolence and they respond by benevolence. It's an interesting sort of juxtaposition, actually. People either are all out for themselves, or they do the best for other people. Comment what you think about that, because it's definitely, there's definitely an interesting contrast there, at least. So tell me what you think in the comments. To briefly go back to the book itself, when it comes to the characters, they were quite interesting because essentially they represented different archetypes of individuals. So there would be a layman person who didn't really know much about the plague, but they were kind of socially prudent. And the main guy, Dr. Rooks, I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly. I'm probably not. So please don't crucify me in the comments if I'm messing that up. But he was the main character, and he was the most assertive and somewhat intelligent individual throughout this entire story. And as well as that, there is an unnamed narrator throughout the piece, which also adds a level of mysteriousness, which is interesting. I always think that there needs to be some sort of mysterious element to a story, especially in horror. I mean, if you've seen Alien Covenant and the other Alien films, this might be a tangent, but sort of thing, it proves my point in a way. In Alien Covenant, which I think is an interesting film, and I like rewatching it just because of the themes of the sci-fi themes and so forth. But aside from that, the xenomorph, the main kind of alien, the threat, it was just there was no mystery really behind it. They didn't kind of shroud it in shadows like in the first Alien in like the 1986 or 1982, whenever it was, in 1970, I can't remember now. But the reason why the first Alien film was so good is because you barely even saw what the creature was, and that was because it was scary. And the Alien films is a precise example of when less is more. And when it comes to this sort of scenario, this kind of narrative, less is certainly more. Not knowing who's narrating this makes the ending much more climactic and much more meaningful. And so it kind of unveils in a very nice way, which I did appreciate. But yeah, also, if you haven't seen the Alien films and you're a fan of like thriller, horror sort of films or narratives, check that out. You really should have seen it already, but yeah, the Alien films are really good. Well, apart from anything past Alien 2, don't watch that. Prometheus is good as well. Another really interesting thing that I thoroughly enjoyed on a personal level was the amount of religiosity that the society of Oran had. There was kind of a pastor, sort of priest, who was preaching, and by the time the plague was real, sort of, by the time everybody recognized it for what it was, instead of denying its very existence, the priest was saying, well, talking in terms of we and us instead of you. And that's a very, well, yeah, I mean, that's a very prevalent thing to happen in a dictatorship or in politics, or, as I just mentioned, in churches. And the reason for that is that, well, as Christopher Hitchens says in Letters to a Young Contrarian, which I've also reviewed, he said that we should beware the language of us and we, because as soon as it switches from you to us to we, it gets very dangerous and very dubious. And this is because the priest is trying to entice these people with open arms, with an ingratiating smile, saying that, oh, you can find hope, you can find solidarity in the church and with your fellow religious individuals. But in actual fact, I'd argue that it's just false consolation. And if there is anything that I do dislike, it's false consolation. There's sort of this sermon that occurs, and it's blatantly obvious of the language that this priest is using, this sort of Jesus smuggling into despair, which is oh so common in times of tragedy. But it's this all or nothing sort of perspective. This accept Christ, accept the Saviour, and you fall into his loving arms, and if not, you face eternal damnation with the flames burning across your carcass. It's extremely black and white, and it's just very alienating. Another thing that I wanted to talk about as well, very briefly though, is just the brilliant prose of writing. Camus throughout the piece used a broad range of words, many that I didn't know, and I felt like at the same time though it wasn't difficult to read. I felt that it was perfectly challenging, but also welcoming. And I think that is the charm of Camus in general, because as we saw, or at least what I've seen from him, his kind of appearances and his overall feel is very charismatic, very joyful, and but also very deep as well. And so Camus was an individual who wasn't militant in any way, but at the same time he wasn't soft. He was a man of character, a man of, he was very humble in his approach to knowledge and to writing. And I think that's something that, it's a very difficult balance to reach when you're making such extreme proclamations, for example, saying the Myth of Sisyphus, saying that life is ultimately meaningless, but why not live it perfectly, happily anyway, for example. That's a very extreme point or perspective. But at the same time, Camus is so nuanced and charming about it. And I think that is what his work is. It's very charming, but also very, very meaningful. So yes, I would recommend you to read this book if you haven't already, especially given the politics and the implications of COVID that it's had on many countries. I think it's, as I said, even more relevant today than it would have been to read last year or even the past 20 years. I think it's most relevant to read now, and it's not too difficult to read, but it's not also a very simplistic story, so to speak. And I know that I haven't delved too much into the story itself, but I think that's because I'm more interested in what it tells me instead of what it plays out to be. But I also want you to read it for yourself and experience it for yourself, and not just tell you what happens, why it happens. You know, I think that kind of defeats the purpose of literature in general, or a film, or any piece of art. I think the experience is the key component to the piece itself. So yeah, I haven't really rehearsed or recited the story, and I don't intend to in my book reviews. I want to give you my thoughts, what it made me think, and the implications of those thoughts and their applications in real life. This has been me, ahead of the curve, reviewing Albert Camus' The Plague. I'm very grateful for your participation in viewing this video. Once again, leave a like if you did like the video, and subscribe for more. And be sure to check out my Goodreads account, where you can track which books I read, my Instagram page, and my Patreon if you wish to get benefits for donating to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next review. Arrivederci.